Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new podcast series. My name is Patrick Teahan. I'm a licensed clinical therapist specializing in childhood trauma. And what this podcast series will be focusing on, we're going to be focusing on people's individuals' expressive stories, getting to the heart of the matter that what happened to us in our childhood. We're also going to be omitting a lot of clinical jargon and just focusing on the story, not the diagnosis. And we're also going to focus on the relationship recovery process, which is the model of childhood trauma therapy that I do. It was developed by Amanda Curtin, LICSW, and is also known as RRP. So let's get into this episode. I'm with my friend Orenda Fink. She is the author of The Witch's Daughter, which I recently read. I think I finished it about... I think like a month and a half ago, and then I immediately needed to talk to you because there was so many amazing points and so many questions. Like, it was a really inspiring book. And for those who aren't familiar with Orenda, she's the author of The Witch's Daughter. She is a Jungian practitioner of shadow work. And I think what really drew me to the book was really your history in the indie rock world for the past 25 years. You started off in a band called Little Red Rocket, which was out of, where was it? Was that out of Birmingham?
Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Most notably, there is O+S, which is more of a recent project. Is that right?
That's right.
And who was that with?
That was with my friend Cedric Lemoyne from a band called Remy Zero.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. And then probably what is you're most known for is your duo band of Azure. Is that right?
Yes.
You can go and no one knows you, where the winter is kind.
And who was your partner in that band?
Her name's Maria Taylor, and she also has an amazing solo career as well. And we met in Birmingham, Alabama. We were actually in Little Red Rocket together, and then went on to form
That's
Azure.
right.
Yeah.
So that's been like a long-term partnership with many kind of different variations in it.
Yes.
What was the band that you guys were kind of incognito?
Oh, the Casket Girls.
Yes, I love that.
I can't go back. It's almost comforting. I'm in the black. I don't feel anything. I'm so depressed.
Really?
I love that project. That's with my friend Morgan Nagler. Yeah.
Okay, right. I think I loved it because it was just so probably refreshing to get out of your usual stuff, your usual thing. And when I really checked that out on online, I just really loved it because it just seemed like really, really fun. So if anyone wants to check out these bands, and one question was, do I have this right, that Eric Bachman of Crooked Fingers and Archers of Loaf, did he call you guys whispercore?
I don't know if he called us that, but somebody did along the way, and yeah, the name ended up sticking. But Eric Bachman did produce most of our records, or definitely he helped form the sound around those whispery vocals. So he was really instrumental in Azure's formation.
Neat, yeah, and it's wow. It's I think it's almost like we all kind of need that kind of mentoring. And was he able to do that with you both in terms of crafting something, or did you guys come in with something?
We came in with the songs, really just recorded on acoustic guitar, and then we had some lead melodies that went along with it that were kind of crudely played on a 4-track. And then Eric he's just a genius. So, and he's from Asheville, I think, too.
I didn't know that.
No, maybe Chapel Hill.
Okay, sure.
Archers of Loaf. And he would just create these masterpieces. I mean, I'm not saying my band's a masterpiece, but he would create these masterpiece instrumentals that would go along with these songs that, and we just knew right away they were so genius. So he was a really hands-on producer, kind of creating these soundscapes that would go with the songs.
And he kind of contributed.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So for the listener to check out any of these bands, Azure, O+S, Little Red Rocket, which is earlier and a lot of fun, as well as the Casket Girls.
Casket Girls, yeah.
Casket Girls, cool. So that's like the music part. That'll probably be interwoven throughout like this discussion because the book usually is it's actually changed for me, but I've recently in the past 6 months I've stopped practicing. So I'm much more writing, I'm more training other therapists. But something was interesting was happened is when I was practicing and working with people in groups with childhood trauma, like doing the mental therapy that I do called RRP, is I couldn't read trauma memoirs. Like I couldn't even read self-help books. Like when people would say, you got to read this, it's so good. I think it was really because in my week to week, I would be hearing people's personal stories, and there was a certain cap that you know what I mean? So it was refreshing. Your book, as well as Jeanette McCurdy's book, was the first couple books that I picked up after I stopped practicing, and I could now have the headspace for it. And I think I think your book is so important in the way that for me, it really spells out, and you did a beautiful job at this, of spelling out, it's kind of a funny soup that happens to us as kids. But what I really loved about the book is you were just kind of spelling out the loss of normalcy around growing up in some chaos and some poverty, as well as having a parent struggling with a personality disorder of borderline personality disorder, which was your mother is really the focus of kind of the book. But I also really love how much you include kind of your father in that, because in my work, there's very much, I wish this wasn't true, there's a very patternized presentation of one parent struggling with a personality disorder, and then there is the co-parent kind of within that, or the codependent parent within that I find we have a lot of work to do around, because most cases that codependent parent is often the safer one, sort of like on paper. They're not really that safe, you know, as the book kind of unfolds into kind of figuring that out. But you did a beautiful job at kind of talking us through all of that while telling your story.
Well, thank you. And I want to say quickly, thank you for reading the book. I sent you the book because your work is instrumental in my and my sister's healing. So thank you for everything that you do. Sure. And it means a lot to me to be here speaking with you. But yes, actually, it's interesting because I was talking to a friend earlier about, as I do interviews on this book and this topic, when I talk about my father, that's the spot, that's the wound that still is really painful, because I definitely spent my life trying to save both of them in certain ways, but there was sort of this kind of underground kinship with my father that we were all somehow victims together of my mother's abusive behavior. Right. And so it was really difficult, as I decided to go no contact with my mother, I had to go no contact with my father because he's so enmeshed in that relationship. So it's almost like we all had to make a choice, and I lost my father in the mix. And it is part of the healing work to understand, well, he was part of the problem, it wasn't really my job to save him either. And there actually was no way that I could have, and so, yeah, I totally agree. There is a lot of work to do that, because it's almost like, there's like one, problem parent, and then the other parent is more like the kids. And that's a problem in and of itself.
Absolutely. And you just kind of nailed it in talking about that kind of parent, where I think as children, this was true for me as well, is we look at the safer parent really as a victim. And it wasn't until I got into therapy did my therapist kind of start to point out, well, they were an adult who had a lot more power than you did, and they had choice. And those ideas really blew my mind at the time. Do you know what I mean? Because it's just, you see, and and many things can be true at once. Like my safer parent was very much like a classic kind of fell into a relationship with a narcissist who loved bombed. You know what I mean? And it's just like, but I find that that co-parent or codependent parent who's stuck in it, they have their own narrative going on, and sometimes that narrative can be like, let's just kill him with kindness. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The narrative in terms of like protecting children should be, this is inappropriate, let's get you out of here. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's something that really blew my mind learning that in therapy, because it's sort of like we're so used to our family that we don't quite see the power structures or choices or that kind of a thing. Like even if it's an alcoholic parent, you know what I mean? Like for someone saying they actually could have gone to meetings and gotten sober on your behalf, like that's a possibility.
Right.
But we
Yeah.
just know them. We just know them as like a daily committed drinker, totally chaotic or whatever, that it's kind of outside of the realm of possibility.
Yeah, that's right. And, when I think about my father, and as far as like, not being as safe as I kind of thought he was, really in hindsight, I mean, you never know when you think about the past how things could have been differently, but
Mm-hmm.
that he was the one that always kept me back in the relationship, because in the book I kind
Yeah.
of tell about several times where I had been pushed to the brink of, really almost insanity by my mother, and had just exploded
Mm-hmm.
and decided to go no contact before I even knew what those words meant, or had heard them. It was always my father that kind of reached out separately and really begging me to apologize to her for things she had done, just to make it okay. And it was kind
Mm-hmm.
of like, just between us, just tell her you're sorry and it'll all go away. And that's what we all need. And so it was
Right.
almost it was almost like a cult. I just kept getting brought back in by him, where I'm pretty certain that I might have gone, detached from my mother at a much younger age if I wasn't kind of being pulled
Mm-hmm.
back in by him.
I'm so glad you said that as well, because I think that, again, I got to say your book is genius in the way that you spell out what so many of us kind of go through. And that issue within a family that's either a toxic family or abusive, whatever kind of like, however we want to identify the family, is, there's usually this thing about the most toxic person kind of has soldiers around them that keeps the family myth kind of going, and it's just like, I really like the way that you kind of spell that, like, and really talking about that, where that was hard to read when, you would have been in a situation where you were really abused by mom, even in adulthood, some kind of batshit crazy thing happened that happens in these families. And then in the 11th hour, you find yourself apologizing. You know, could you
Mhm.
talk more about that? Because I find like that's so poignant in terms of what happens to us, where we find ourselves kind of in the mess of it, but also a little bit dissociative. Am I wrong here? I guess.
Oh yeah. I mean, but it's interesting because I've known for a long time that I wasn't wrong, and was still apologizing just to keep just to keep myself in the family. Um, and so it had this different kind of, um, it felt like futile, like a little bit of futility, a little bit of resignation, a little bit of hopelessness, that
Mm-hmm.
there's never going to be a change out of this. And again, before I'd educated myself on personality disorders, I was completely in the dark about this. That's why I think it's so important for people to educate themselves on how this works. It's maddening when you cannot put any kind of rational, attributes onto what is occurring around you. So this cyclical nature of this kind of getting drawn back into this family myth, and then being really pushed to the brink in some way or the other by, my mother in my case, exploding on the person, and then all of a sudden I'm the bad guy and I now am the problem. Just, after enduring, whether it's days, months, or years of abuse, then the moment that you kind of actually stand up for yourself, you're the bad guy. And it's gaslighting, it's confusing. And ultimately though, I just kind of knew that it was going to start the cycle over again. And when I mentioned in the book that, the last time I kind of had this situation with my mother, and my father did ask me to apologize, I did. Something had shifted in me that last time I did it, and I knew that she was going to take my apology, because she always did. It didn't matter what I said. If I apologized and just said I didn't mean it, it would just all be washed away, and then the cycle would start all over again. I knew that she would take the apology. It was more of, once she did, oh my God, I have to do this again. And that's when it really set in, that this will never end. I have to get out of it. Although I didn't even get out of it then. It actually took another instance to finally ultimately have the strength to end the cycle.
Right. And it's sort of like what you're describing is the kind of game that happens. Do you know what I mean? Like the cycle or the pattern that you recognize, like something abusive and crazy happens. There might be some distance or some tension, and then somebody has to apologize to keep it going. But it's not going to be the main perpetrator who does that. Or if they do it, that would be a really manipulative kind of swept under the rug kind of a thing,
Yeah, and I think some people do that kind of gaslighty apology, but don't change. But my mother actually never did. She never apologized for anything. She would not or could not see it.
I'm laughing because it's like our moms are so similar. Do you know what I mean? Like my mom, I think for some folks who struggle in that way, they feel like they're going to die if they admit fault. Like something is so much at stake. I haven't really worked out my full thoughts on it, but you know what I mean? Like they can never be in that shame place of being wrong.
Yeah, I know.
So,
I do know what you mean. And same for me. It's like, I think when you kind of grow up in the system and you have your awakening, you really want to understand it, like on this. And I think you talked about that before, how you can kind of go down too much of a rabbit hole of trying to, gather all this knowledge about personality disorders and how it all works. Um, for me, I'm still doing it. I'm still in it. I still want to know, what is it exactly that is this disconnect with reality or vulnerability that the disordered person has? And it's hellish, I'm sure, for them and for everyone involved. But it's true nonetheless. My mother especially could not see. It's like, and that took me a long time to realize that I don't think that she's even aware that she's wrong. It is her reality, and her reality looks very different from everyone else around hers.
Right. Right. And that going down the route, I think it is also really good to be educated, but I think sometimes I guess what I'm saying, there's nothing wrong with continuously researching, and because it's a fascinating topic, you know what I mean? It's a hard topic. But I think if we just continue to kind of educate ourselves on it, we can also distract ourselves from the work. You know what I mean? Like as if a new blog post or new video or new book is going to give us the answer that makes the pain go away or the questioning go away or something like that, where in many ways, even in the work that I do, I try to get out of those conversations in the room about the diagnosis and just keep it to like, that was your mom or that was your dad, and what a healthy parent would and would not do in that way. Because it's sometimes, just like anything else, anything overly cerebral is going to get in the way of process.
Yeah, I can see that. For me though, it's interesting as I think about that. I really latched onto that, I think, in a way because I am codependent. And therefore was so enmeshed with my parents. And also, lots of times people get into other relationships like that in their life as well. And it's almost like I was doing the inner work as too, but I needed to know what it was on an academic level almost so I could spot it. because I was so used to it
Sure.
being just the way people are, like this is just normal behavior. So it's almost like I had to relearn what normal healthy behavior is
Yep.
by researching it.
Right.
So it's weird. It's almost like I don't know. Did you feel that way when you really kind of started coming into understanding what was going on, that you needed to do that?
Yeah, it's a really it's a beautiful topic is when we kind of wake up that there's something really wrong. And I think that people do need to research. I think we can get addicted to that kind of research because it's a little bit like you, my world was upside down. And when I started therapy, the drug folks that I would hang out with, or people who were really a little bit off or incredibly traumatized as well, or people who were predatory really in
Mm-hmm.
my late teens. Um, the work that I did helped me when I think if we take a real honest look at our family in a way, it also is helpful or sets us up for more success about reclaiming perception. Because I think in our families, it's really, I think a top tier thing about abuse is the abuse around perception. Like what you were talking about earlier, that something your mom would do that she would set up and create and was really painful to the other family members, but it just kind of tumbled through that she was the actual victim in it. You know what I mean? That story
Mm-hmm.
is like really when I started therapy as a young man, I could not decipher between who was safe for me and who wasn't. I
Yeah.
could not decipher between who was, and it worked both ways. There were relationships that I got out of and tanked and was even like nasty in with good people. And then I was also drawn to people who weren't good for me. So all of that, I think, comes down to intuition, trusting our gut, really looking at people's character because I was really in my inner child, just
Yeah.
like thinking the best of people or thinking that everyone was out to get me, but it was like really crosswired.
Yeah. And, for me, I didn't have too much of that paranoia. People are out to get me, but this is something I feel like I finally kind of started to get over.
Mm-hmm.
But was really prone to flattery. So, which is, that narcissistic kind of love bombing trap.
Yeah.
Um, and, maybe it was something deep within me that just always was really searching for this validation that I never got from my mother.
Sure.
But I really, I mean, when I would meet people and they would flatter me or pump up, my self-concept, I mean, I'm in,
All in.
like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, all in, red flags,
Right.
who cares? And so that to me, I think was like a real driving force with my relationships. And now I look back on it and I'm like, oh, oh my God, like what a, no, terrible mistake,
I know.
um,
Right.
but that was a big one for me, I think, is not being able to recognize the red flags once my self-esteem was bolstered by someone.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
even when they were ripping it out from under me, I was already in at that point.
Yeah. In a big, like all in is also a black and white, like this person is forever elevated in my mind or something like
Mhm.
that's where a lot of the mess happened. I want to come back to the book because something you said earlier about when you would apologize, even if you knew you were not in the wrong, is like you were doing this diplomatic thing, Can you talk a little bit about the premise of the book, The Witch's Daughter, for those who are not familiar with the book yet or familiar with you, is like where can you talk about your mom a little bit? And also throughout the book, there's this fear of being, I think you called it X'd. You're going to be X'd out, excommunicated. So, which is kind of there's some irony there in a way of where you end up in your recovery around it. So, could you maybe talk to the listener a little bit about about the book, about your mom?
Yeah, so I always had a, very complicated relationship with my mother, and she's very eccentric, artist, very charismatic, and but very troubled, alcoholic, and when I say borderline, that is she has not been diagnosed as borderline. That is my understanding based off
Mm-hmm.
of therapy and research. And so it's really about having a really intense, unexplainable childhood without realizing that it was abuse till quite later. And ultimately breaking away from that toxic family system. Because I was very much enmeshed in that family myth. The family myth of our family was that we're special and we're just this unit that never breaks, no matter what happens. My mother is a painter. She is a self-proclaimed witch. She practices witchcraft. We're from Alabama, so it's kind of her own little Southern witchcraft that she does on her own. And she told me stories about her witchcraft starting at a very young age for myself, like an inappropriate age. I, start the book out in the first couple of chapters where much of my childhood that I remember is sitting on a stool opposite of my mother while she drinks and smokes and plays honky-tonk music and tells me about witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about 6, 7, 8 years old.
I'm laughing because the only difference between I would be sitting on a stool in a bar with my mom, and she wouldn't be talking about witchcraft, but she'd be listening to Irish music and gossiping about other people. So it's like,
yeah,
I feel you on it.
yeah. It's like I was her little bar buddy,
Right.
But there was also, this very dark component, this witchcraft component, that was, very dark. And seemed very real to me at the time. It's your mother, so it's kind of the world that you're inhabiting there. And so then there's, but there's also, all of those kind of things that go along with what we understand to be borderline personality disorder, a real fear of abandonment, the sense, the need to control others, the idealization, the devaluation, and really just the drama. I always called it like a tornado. It was just an absolute hurricane, every other week or every week or what, if I came to visit. And it was scary. Kind of being around her was scary. It's kind of even hard to say in a small amount of time. That's why I ultimately ended up writing a book about it. But what happened was that, one of the many times that I was kind of broken by her behavior and did explode on her, I remembered that my therapist had mentioned, I obviously can't diagnose your mother, but it sounds like she has borderline personality disorder. And that was about a decade ago. And I read it and I was like, yep, that's her, but it didn't sink into me what that meant. And I continued to just go right back into the codependent cycle for another decade. And so when that last kind of blow up happened.
Can you talk a little bit more about what that cycle would look like? Because I was going to ask you, in the book, you reference coming home from tours. You reference after an album would be done recording, or you would go home for a holiday and bring your now husband, to those, what did those 10 years, what was the behaviors like in those 10 years?
It's interesting. When I think back on it, I feel like with her personality disorder, everyone kind of, and this is, common with these toxic family households, that everyone's kind of treated differently, right? Everyone has their own experience with the person, their own role that they're playing.
Yep.
And so with mine, I feel like was very connected to that dysfunction with my father. So with my father, she was very aggressive, very mean, very cruel, very punishing. And I felt like his protector, but I also, so she was very punishing to him, but what she wanted from me was always to be saved in some kind of way. That was my role. I was the savior, the all good child. And so I spent my life kind of, being there, listening to her problems, which I ultimately feel like a lot of them were fabricated. I mean, a lot of the things that happened to her in her life were fabricated. I found out later. And I don't even know how much of this she really felt, but it was all very dramatic, either supernatural or, my husband has left me. Sometimes she would make up things about how she was being physically abused by him, which we know didn't happen. There was financial issues that I actually don't even really talk about that much in the book, but always multiple bankruptcies, always on the brink of some kind of financial ruin. Just in every way possible, my mother would be crying and begging to be saved. And it would get very dark into maybe some kind of almost even like, again, I'm trying not to be super diagnosy about it, but even kind of like dissociative identity disorder things where she might go into multiple personalities, kind of schizophrenic breaks, go back in time, reliving things that I'm not actually even sure ever happened. Very traumatic for me as a child and even an adult child of this person.
Yeah.
Where, go ahead.
Would it get, a couple things is, I think, I know what you mean where we don't want to be diagnosing people from afar, but you were close with her. Like you lived with her for, you know what I mean? I kind of learned it's sort of like, I can freely say my father had narcissistic personality disorder, not because I'm a therapist, but because I lived with him for 18 years.
Yeah.
And it's okay. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that because it does feel nice to not have that language gate kept. When you have experienced such a intense version of it, where it's like, so if I can be allowed to speak my truth, it's, I know she has this,
right.
I have no doubt.
I've heard a lot of stories about somebody going to a therapist and describing everything that you're describing and kind of going, I wonder if my dad is a narcissist, or I wonder if my mother is antisocial, something, you know what I mean? It's pretty wounding when the therapist goes, well, how would you know that? Have they seen a therapist? You know what I mean? Like that kind of a thing. And I can get both sides of the issue, but people can be really shot down in what they know. And at the other side to it is that there's also in our culture right now, there's an overdiagnosis from afar. I think that's my issue. That it's really kind of from afar without really getting to know somebody, but
Yeah, or a simplification of what is going on, like you said, but we've lived with these people. We know it inside and out. We've experienced it.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. The other kind of question that I have is, are you describing her from a place, do you think that she struggled with some psychosis at times?
Yes, I know she did. Yeah.
Okay. What would that look like?
The psychosis would look like what I mentioned before, some of it where she would kind of go into multiple personalities, either slip into now I'm like acting like a child being abused at that moment, like fully playing out a scene, which is pretty terrifying again, as when it's your mother.
Yeah.
This is always heavily alcohol induced. But
felt really real to her.
Well, I mean, it seemed like she was actually had gone into a multiple personality.
Yeah.
My sister has recounted times that she had repressed actually when my mom had gone into a multiple personality when they were arguing. And that was interesting. It came out like at the very end of when I was writing the book, my sister had this repressed memory come up. Wow. And I was like, oof, wow, that's dark. And so there were things like that. There were her, that went along with the witchcraft and the supernatural. There were demons and possessions. And, she even attempted suicide when I was very young because she thought she was possessed by a demon. Ghosts, lots of ghosts, the spells that are being cast on people. It was quite a lot. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about, and also relating from a different place where when we're both 5 years old, when my mother would be drinking and gossiping, or essentially talking about the people in her life who let her down, like that was her main thing, drinking and then being morose about the people who were letting her down. When we're 5, we don't have the abstract thinking to know that it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the abstract thinking to be like, come on, mom, don't you think don't you think you were a little bit off that you wanted to borrow $200 from a person that you don't really know and you put them on the spot? You know what I mean? Like,
Like there was none of that because we're kids. So when you're growing up with your mom and she's talking about witchcraft or demons, or is it almost, I don't like the word, I don't even know if the word is correct, like putting a spell on somebody or a hex on somebody to get
What
back at them? Because that was a little bit in the book as well.
That's what she would do, yes. When she
Right,
did spells, they were revenge spells. So they were always very kind of dark black
right.
magic. Yeah.
And when you were a little girl, you don't know that it's not real. You don't know that that's not really how the world works. Like was there a time when you kind of, because I also love in the book, you talk about going to Haiti
Hmm.
to study a little bit of voodoo to kind of like, I'm assuming kind of figure things out, process more. It's also an interest, but at one point, do you kind of realize that your mother's powers are not maybe exactly powers, but psychosis, if that's fair to say in that way?
It is, and it's in the book. I try to like really keep that open as much as possible, and because that was my experience, not really understanding that till way later in life. But I always questioned it because I knew that there was psychosis there and mental
Hmm.
illness, but did that discount that spiritual magic side? Could they
Yeah, I
could they
know.
both be true? Um,
Right. It's like if she wasn't a witch, but just like a Reiki practitioner, the way she behaved around Reiki probably would have ruined Reiki for you. Do you know what I mean? Or you know what I mean? Like but I'm guess what I'm trying to say too, like whether if I had a dad who was like a traveling musician, I might have a disgust for traveling musicians or something like that, in a way like, what you sort of said. I guess maybe what my next question would be is that given that experience, like it doesn't sound like to me that supernatural curiosity fully got ruined for you, if you
no,
follow me.
well, and that's why I love working in the Jungian sphere,
Right.
because it really hits that sweet spot for me where it's not so superstitious,
Hmm.
and and it feels not dark like what my mother was doing, but it still really kind of attempts to answer or poke around a little bit in the dark of the unconscious, which is kind of the spirit world, the archetypal world, and that where you kind of connect to what I consider divinity. So there's like godlike qualities in the collective unconscious and our self, beyond our conscious awareness.
Mm.
Jung's work really hits that spot where, yeah, no, my mother's psychosis and abuse did not take that away from me. And that's the kind of thing too, like even with, your abuser, um, when it's your mother, it's still your mother. You got some good things from her,
Yeah.
and so it's kind of like, but yeah, and that's part of the difficult walk, I think, of childhood,
Hmm.
narcissistic abuse survivors of, no, having that grief for the good things and having to separate that and get rid of the bad things. So,
Yes. But
yeah.
also reclaim. I'm very grateful that my mother supported music. The reason why I'm able to talk to you today is my mother had amazing bedside manner. She was like a very fun, bubbly Irish woman who could talk to anybody. So I learned the skill of just being able to talk to people from her. But I think in some ways, what an abusive or toxic parent models is like exactly what you just kind of said. We kind of need to separate it, but also reclaim it as a gift of our own. You know what I mean? That it's
Hmm.
like doesn't have to be, because sometimes many people, there's a very common thing with childhood trauma survivors, say hypothetically if they are raised by a very gregarious, charming person, that their inner child or their subconscious might associate really being out there and being charming or whatever as something manipulative.
Hmm.
It's manipulative when that's not. Do you know what I mean? Like there's just
Yeah.
some people who like love the gift of the gab or whatever, and it doesn't always have to mean that. So there's a process of separating those things out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And, in some ways, my mother's, um, I guess, connection or attraction to the supernatural, and weirdly, she took something that could have been beautiful and mystical and made it really about narcissism, about control,
Yeah.
kind of control and dominance and fear and retribution. And it
Mm-hmm.
fits right in with the disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it like became her like worldview or her meaning making in life
Yes.
in
Yeah.
some ways. Yeah.
Mhm. And it gave her power. I think it gave her a sense of power that she, for whatever reason, never tried to claim in any other way. It's almost
Which,
like an excuse to not take any other power because she's a witch. She's just going to put a spell on you.
mm-hmm.
you know. Um,
Right.
mhm.
Right. And there's some fascinating Jungian symbolism there or archetypes, you know what I mean? Like because when I think about when I was reading about Jung, I just didn't really realize of course he would sort of start here is that he was a psychiatry resident in Switzerland and it was like literally went to school and then he was a therapist in an acute psychiatry locked psych ward. And that's where he kind of started really kind of working with people. He didn't start off just as like a private practice working with anybody. And what I find fascinating is that's where he formulated those original ideas. And this is really my layman's understanding of Jung. It's been many years since I read him. But one thing that probably not really related, but like kind of relevant is he was a student of Freud's. And Jung was very, kind of dedicated to his work with patients. And something really, this always sticks in my mind is that Freud had said something to Carl, why do you keep working with these really mentally ill women? They're not easy on the eyes or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Like it was just so off and indicative of the times of that. You know what I mean? And it kind of really spells out the difference of who Jung was. Because he wasn't focused on that, he was just like, I imagine the man was with the patient in the room in those moments and not somewhere else.
From my understanding, that it has a lot to do with that nebulous area between the shadow and the ego,
Yeah.
the conscious and the unconscious.
Right.
And basically that they have many more steps into the unconscious world that are kind of seeping into their consciousness. So for him, I think they were a great study alongside of what he was trying to see in the unconscious. And he felt like he could heal them too. That by, that was some of his, more challenging patients. He thought of it as a challenge, and he saw it completely differently than Freud or anyone else at that time.
Wow. Good way to put it. Really good way to put it. Because it's like thinking about, from what I know, like that's where collective unconscious, the things that he would hear from his patients were those beginning ideas of themes and patterns that he would see in symbolism and
archetypal symbols and symbols in the dream world.
Right.
He was starting to see a pattern with that in the schizophrenic hallucinations, basically. So that's when he was like, okay, well, there's something connected here.
Right. Right. How did you get into? Can you talk about, if it's okay, can you talk about some therapy that you did and how did you go from a lot of things are overlapping? You're writing this book, you're going to therapy, you're writing this book. This was an 8-year project, which is like, takes a lot of dedication to sort of finish. Do you know what I mean? Because it was so well done. But I think another thing that I loved about your book is it felt like to me, to the reader, that they are going with you through a process that you're going through, like in real time, which I really loved. But can you talk about some therapy work that you did, and how did that end up being into like a Jungian shadow work practitioner?
I started therapy about 12 or 13 years ago. For the first time, I'd never gone to therapy when my dog died. I had a dog for 16 years.
Right.
And when he died, I just basically had kind of a nervous breakdown, existential crisis. And a friend of mine said, "You need to go to therapy." I was like, "Therapy?" And I did, and it was, obviously I had an amazing therapist, and she quickly was like, "This is not about your dog. This is about some, deep childhood trauma that you." I honestly didn't even realize that I even had. That's how kind of into the family myth that I was in. I mean, I knew that I had. I didn't even call it trauma then. I knew that it was a lot of the stories that I recount in the book were disturbing to me. But I didn't know what any of that was at that time. So that was really a godsend to go to therapy for the first time with a really amazing therapist who was not a Jungian analyst, but she was very Jungian informed psychotherapist. And so she, one of the first questions she asked me was, "Do you remember your dreams?" And I have a very active dream life. Lots of nightmares up until that point, which I now know is a lot about resisting repression, which makes sense with everything that I was repressing about my family and my mother. So we did a lot of dream work, and it just blew my mind wide open that all these dreams that had kind of been haunting me my whole life actually had really beautiful messages for me that were desperate to get through. And so that comes in the form of a nightmare, and it just opened up this whole world for me, and it really brought me into my, like, what I call my divinity, or that kind of divine space of the true self. It's like, oh, there's a me here that I don't know, that I'm not connected with. And it was the first time I understood that. I was so in my childhood trauma, I think, it's like you're in your trauma self. I think you call it the trauma personality, right?
Yeah.
I was just only trauma personality,
Right.
and thinking that was me. So that therapy gave me that great gift. And also that my therapist did mention 10 years ago, "I think your mother probably has borderline. You should look into that." She didn't beat me down with that. She didn't
Good.
force
Right.
me to whatever. And so, but that was the first time that I ever put that together. And so, forward to 10 years, 12 years later, after COVID, after writing the book, and wanting to kind of take a little bit of a shift from music, my heart was calling me to do something else. And it's calling me to help people who have gone through what I've gone through the book and through coaching. So I did a certification in Jungian shadow work and dream work, and work with people with their dreams and active imagination and their conscious everyday triggers to look into what you're talking about, that kind of narrative that gets unconsciously created in childhood of like who I am, who I must be, who I can't be, why, and is this true? Like, are there parts of me that, I actually need to call up at this point and use as tools in my life?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
If it's okay, do you remember, and it's, if you don't want to kind of talk about it, what was some of those nightmares that, because you're with somebody who's skilled in unpacking them. But I love the way you couch that, is in where, like, whether it's a dream, a nightmare, a trigger, or like a subconscious mission that we're on, they are messengers. They are telling us there's something you need to look at or fix here,
Yes. And, the way, the kind of structure in which I look at nightmares are that they are from the shadow. That's the shadow realm. So if anything is attacking you, or you're even, you're attacking it, or there's some kind of antagonistic fight or fear, that's the shadow, meaning something that you are repressing that wants to make itself known. Now, the dream is showing it as this scary thing because it's scary to the ego. The ego is frightened of it. And but in fact, you really, what that, when you don't know what the dream means, you think it's something that you should still stay away from. But really, the flip side, the underworld of the dream world, is that it's actually something you need to bring into conscious awareness and integrate. And what that is, sometimes takes many sessions to kind of figure out, because it's symbolic, symbolic for these kind of energetic complexes that Jung calls them. But for me, a lot of nightmares about my mother, just kind of plagued with nightmares about my mother my whole life. And, it's not surprising, kind of based off of the imagery and things I saw and were witness to. But even when we were getting along wonderfully, I would be plagued with these very dark nightmares. I could just describe them as just straight up horror movies. Very disturbing. Kind of, either being like choked or, kind of thrown against a wall like a horror movie, or she's like, her face is turned purple and her eyes are bulging out and she's like pouring alcohol into her face and vomiting. And I mean, just very, very dark horror movie stuff. Being chased, kind of being sexually molested by her, which I wasn't, but that is a part of the dream symbolism. That, means something symbolically that's in line with that. Trying to integrate, something about my mom that I needed to integrate. Ultimately, what I realized was like, yeah, what do I need to integrate about my mother? And that's a hard thing for people to kind of stomach sometimes.
Yeah.
The way I see it now is that what I needed to integrate from her is what I finally had to bring up in myself to go no contact with her, which is a selfishness, to say, actually, I'm done with you. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Right.
That X you're talking about, that X, she can X somebody in a heartbeat for nothing. And here I am devoting my one precious life to kind of, being abused by someone. And so I had to bring in that part of her to ultimately save myself.
That is fascinating. And the work that you're describing is super powerful. And it's interesting, like there are different ways to get there. How I understand it, how I formulate that stuff in my mind is that I love what you just sort of said, is that your shadow would be to become the thing that you are most terrified of, which is to be selfish.
That's right.
How would that have originated? Would she tell you you're selfish? Or was that the family narrative that if you weren't supporting her, you were selfish, or all of it?
I don't think she ever told me that I was selfish, but I think that the unconscious fear that had been created in by being the all good child, the savior, was that my not only my love, or her love for me was predicated on this role, but her actual survival. I mean, I do think that I really felt like she would die without me.
There it is.
My own mother would, yeah.
Wow. And for Jungian dream analysis, the ego is afraid of abandoning her to become selfish in that way. But then and it's very similar to kind of the work that I do, is that I would call it kind of ego or inner child doesn't want to be abusive to people the way that they were abusive to us. So that's one way to look at it. Or because it was probably the hardest thing you did, probably the hardest thing I ever did, was give up on my mom because of many reasons, because there was love there, but mostly because she was a mess that trained me and those around her that if you left her, she would not be able to handle it.
Yes, exactly. Very similar. Is your mom still alive?
Yep.
Do you still have grief, or do you feel like you've gone past that?
It's so funny. I was just talking about this, is that the work that I did kind of cut kind of an ongoing kind of umbilical cord. Sometimes that's healthy, sometimes that's really not. And the grief would be, I don't experience grief kind of around her, but it shows up in a little bit of terms of like sadness. In the way I was just telling my wife the other day, is just like, my mom doesn't know of the success of a YouTube channel that I have, or the notoriety that I've had, or what I mean for people in the recovery world. Like, she has no concept of that. But I've been blessed with other like mentors, and there's my wife's stepmom. There's other people in my life that I've been able to kind of share that success with, who see me in it.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like, I don't really pine for that kind of connection from my mom anymore. And it takes a long time. I did my first cutoff with my mom in 1998. And then there were two other times where I had her in my life and she never really changed her behavior. Um, and then the final cutoff was around 2012. So that's like a really long time to sort of be at distance with someone
Mm-hmm.
that important in your life. But the thing that, and this is going to the listener who's maybe not in this place, this is going to sound brutal, and you don't have to have the same experience that we did. But I kind of encourage people that it's like the relationship needs to pass away. That I think that we do in kind of therapy, and that what do I mean by that is that if we are still fantasizing about them to maybe get better, or if we're still, we're not wrong. It's not bad. All of us want our mother. Even when I'm 80 years old, I'm probably going to want a mom figure. You know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
it's a very
Yeah.
human thing. But when the relationship passes away, it's like we're not wondering about what they're doing on Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds really cold and it sounds really brutal, but I'm just saying there's a process to this. And coming maybe back to your point about like, learning to become selfish in that way, like that learning to be selfish in that way saved my life and I became the person I needed to be in that change.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is I think about that. One of the things that, so when I finished the book, I had not started the Jungian training or coaching yet. So I hadn't done my shadow work at that point. But
Mm.
what kind of forced that for me, forced my hand into actually going through with the no contact, which I knew in my heart was the right thing to do, was that I was writing a book. And I was writing it in real time. In the last quarter of the book, all of that stuff that happens with my sister and where everything's kind of really spectacularly unraveling at the end, I was writing that in real time and not knowing exactly when I was going to end it, but I knew I was close to the end. I just had this deep sense.
Mm.
And there were times where I really struggled with, am I really doing this? Am I ending this relationship now? And I thought, well, what would the hero of this book do at this point? If someone read this book and got to the end and I just went back into it, like it can't end that way, And so in this
Mm.
weird way, I had to step into an archetypal, different archetype to say, no, I do want to be the hero of this book. I want to do the
Yeah.
right thing, you know. And so I kind of had to weirdly kind of fake it. And then
Yeah.
now, of course, I'm like, thank God. I know that I needed to do that, but I did almost have to go outside of my psychic structure, like you said, and bring in something that felt very unfamiliar to me to break the cycle.
Right. I was hearing you talk. I was kind of thinking that, and again, the listener doesn't have to have incredibly toxic parents. Some people have some parents that might be dysfunctional and they can manage that or whatever. But Orenda, when you have a mother like you had, or when you have a mother like I have, we're faced with really two options. You kind of stay in it forever, or you kind of totally deconstruct yourself to individuate,
Mm-hmm.
really to become your own person. And those aren't great options. You know what I mean? Like in a healthy family system, like you're allowed to just become your own person, like you're celebrated for that from the beginning. But the hardest thing I ever did in my life was cutting my mom off.
Mm-hmm.
Like panic
Same.
attack. I was in it for a very long time. It was a very psychically messy experience. But for the listener, when we think about why, is I became who I am through that. You know what I mean? It's a really weird rebirthing, like something really big happens to it. Because I think for the public, they might think that when it's really extreme cases about going no contact, initially people just maybe want pain to stop. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, I kind of tell them
Yes.
we're going no contact to do the opportunity to do some work in the peace of not being continuously abused. You know, that was my experience.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, the pain doesn't stop there, but it's the beginning of a rebirth, like you said. And so there's a different kind of pain that you go through. The pain that
Hmm.
you're probably avoiding and staying in it because you
Right.
don't want to feel that pain. And I think that's why your work is so important because I think I've heard you say, and maybe somebody else, it's like no one wants to go no contact with their parents. It is incredibly painful.
Mm.
But so if you are, you've generally been through quite a bit, and it's a very isolating experience. It's hard, but when you have mothers that are this disordered, you actually just you have to do it for your own survival.
Yeah.
And I've had at least three people. I'm sure you get a lot of people that reach out to you, kind of with heavy stories, but three people that have read my book and said, I'm so glad that you and your sister got out. My sister did not, and she's dead.
Oh,
Yeah, three people.
right.
And that to me, that's a lot.
Right.
Um, and why, suicide, alcoholism, I'm not sure, but that's
Yeah.
understanding. And I like wept for those people, to
Hmm.
think that there is a real consequence to staying in these. And I do think it's better to get out and deal with the pain of that than to
Yeah.
live this other type of life, whatever's on the other side. Like you said, neither one of them are good choices.
Yes. Really well said. And I know what you mean. You just made me think about, I'm currently reading a book about Elliot Smith, and he has an abuse story in his background that no one is able to really clearly define, but he talked about it a lot within his close circle and stuff. And you know learning about him and learning about his like mental health throughout for many many years is really kind of revealing. Like, in other words, as a
Hmm.
therapist, I'm reading this biography on Elliot Smith, kind of just going, yep, that's what happens. But there's a frustrating thing that's not just in this book, it's in society and it's in our culture. There's this weird thing, like, like maybe in high school, if you had friends that went to your houses, you know what I mean? Like, society and our communities can kind of go, yeah, Orenda had it bad. What are you going to do? You know what I mean? Like, there's this kind of like, there's this shrugging of it off, but people do end up addicted to substances in massive pain, or get into relationships with other abusers, or take their own life, which is pretty, so it's like it needs to be taken more seriously. But to come full circle, why I love the book so much is that in the beginning of the book, I think you did a public service about, you're talking about, I might be even be in the first chapter, about how something has happened in your family and you have to apologize again. And I think that there is really like a tipping point crisis and choice that happens for people who go no contact, because we grow up in these families and we don't have a sense of self. And if we stay in high levels of toxicity in the family, we're never going to get there to get that sense of self. And I think what I loved about the book is, you knew that you were self-betraying and would never get to that sense of self if it kept going on,
Hmm.
which I found was really well written. Like, that's what I mean about it being a public service, because you're really spelling out all that stuff. There was so many, before I went no contact, that was like towards the end of my little family kind of imploding. Every holiday felt like I was betraying myself. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And that's a big deal. that can really bum somebody out to stay on a path of being selfless or something like that.
It is a big deal. And I think that I'm so glad you bring this up, because there really is something about that, the difference between the awareness that you're betraying yourself or not the awareness, not the awareness.
Know what you mean? Yeah.
Because many people don't even know that they're betraying themselves. They're not even that in touch with themselves to know that there's a betrayal going on.
Mhm.
They're so in the ego sculpted role
Yeah.
of the narcissist. So to I'd say that's just a great start to even be aware, hey, this feels like a betrayal of self. And then
Mhm.
at that point, hopefully you may go on for years doing that, but at some point there'll be a tipping point where you really decide, no more, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And then you have to really find out, who am I now? Who am I now that this is stripped away? And how can I not repeat this in
Mhm.
relationships with other people?
Yeah. But that was really well said. But it's going to sound bizarre because it all sounds like pain, but I am eternally grateful for figuring out who I was. Like, there's such a payoff in getting away from abusive people, because when we're around them, we're dissociative. If it's worse, if it's family, because it's just like you mentioned, it can just feel perpetual. So it's just where it was kind of this is going to sound egoic, but it was the greatest decision I ever made, because I was able to just become who I needed to be finally, or whatever, or get to know myself, or even like myself, and have some kind of foundation that I was a good person. And I love that you brought up that word selfish, because that's when we have the kind of parent that you're describing in this beautifully written book, they kind of have a global power over their children, to the point that your selfhood isn't yours.
Yes.
So for people, I just think it's like really a beautiful experience for people to kind of get their self back from
It
that.
is, and
Yeah.
you have been doing that work. You went no contact many years before I did, so I almost feel like a baby still. But I completely relate to what you're saying, and I, at 47, when I kind of went no contact and finished this book, felt like I was really starting my life over.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I love all the music that I've done, and that career, and all the people that I've worked with and loved and met along the way. But in some ways, I'm just waking up to who I actually really am now for the first time
Yeah.
in midlife. And there is a kind of a sweet sadness to that and a grief to that, but there's also like an overwhelming amount of beauty and joy.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. I forget where I read this, and this is going to sound really deep and a little bit dark, is that for the listener, um, I think probably one of the saddest things, if we kind of like when we eventually kind of pass away, to never really know ourselves, or to never really know our subconscious or our inner child, kind of a thing, and be kind of caught up in that. And when you asked me earlier about my mom, I thought about that as well. You know what I mean? Like, in a way of, I can love my mom from afar and appreciate her, but also really appreciate that she's not in my life. But for anybody that's really, really hard, is to go through a life really struggling from soup to nuts and not really have yourself, or not really know
Mhm.
yourself in that way. So why I mention that is, like, there's never not a time where someone can do that,
Mhm.
like, and for people to kind of not give up on it, depending on how you're, like, because it's sort of like, I've had many clients in their 50s and 60s, and they're like, what's the point?
Mm.
And my
Mhm.
answer would be, is because you don't want to leave this planet not knowing yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't want to, like, you don't, even if to, like, to know that you weren't a bad kid, you were just in a really unsafe situation, is huge. Do you know what I
Yes.
mean? And there's a lot of
Yes.
compounded grief that comes with all of this stuff, but it's a plug for the work.
It really is. Yeah, and I agree. There is no age limit to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the women who said that to me about her sister passing away was 75.
Yeah.
She's still grieving the fallout from her narcissistic mother, who is also still alive. Her mother's 100.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it doesn't end, and there's some beauty in that as well.
Right.
You know, as long as we have breath, we can
Mm-hmm.
know ourselves.
Yeah. I was really inspired at a retreat that I was at like a month and a half ago. Someone said to me that they were post-retirement and they're kind of just getting to work now, that something I said in a video where do you bring intensity into your work life? And they were like, I had no idea I was doing that. You know what I mean? But I was just so inspired that they're post-retirement, they're not even working anymore. And they've got like a bee in their bonnet to kind of get something done, to learn something about themselves, to learn how childhood may have set them up to be that intense. You know,
Yeah.
if you would like to learn more about Orenda Fink, her music and her work, you just go to orendafink.com. There's something I'd really love for you to know about Orenda is a certified Jungian depth coach with a specialization in dream interpretation, shadow work, and narcissistic abuse recovery. You just go to her website and you can book a session with Orenda if you're interested in doing some work with her around those things. You can also find The Witch's Daughter on Amazon.com, as well as her website. She's on Instagram, she's on all the things, and if I was looking to do some shadow work with somebody, I would want them to be on Spotify as well, and she's on Spotify. You could find her music there as well. It's all at orendafink.com, and thank you so much for joining us today. I've loved this discussion. Trust me, if you pick up The Witch's Daughter, you know, I know it sounds like a cliche, but I wasn't able to put this thing down. It'll be very, very revealing for your own story, and also just an incredibly enjoyable read. You don't have to be an indie rocker like I was to know everyone who she's talking about in this book, but you will still appreciate it. And you'll also appreciate the ongoing playlist that comes with Orenda's career. So this has been a big treat talking with you, and I would love to do this again sometime.
Absolutely, anytime. Thank you so much.